we could have been having a cup of tea. I think it's important that we consider something that is passionate and at the centre of what I want to do. I was a head teacher. I've been a primary teacher. I moved into ITE about 5 years ago. And I've got the practice in the classroom. I've got the practice at ITE. But my research journey is something that is fairly new to me. But I think as a result of that, maybe I come with a certain passion about what I'm finding as I go out there and trying to get this kind of research-driven practice running through. So my perspective is very much as an experienced educator, but very much as a naive but enthusiastic researcher. And this is my journey. This is the journey that I decided to take as part of my induction into Kingston University, and they asked me to take on the Masters. So this is the journey that I took, and hopefully it will provoke a really rich discussion, because I think that at the heart of this research is something really important. And I think any of us that are in ITE are passionate about the future of the profession that we are trying to instill confidence in and trying to build the future of the next generation of teachers that are going to be doing our job. So at the beginning of this journey was a very clear piece of data that I was seeing quite frequently and quite often in the press, and we were talking about it at meetings with colleagues. And for me, it was the trigger to wanting to do some research. So it's been consistent now for a number of years that around 70% of students stay beyond this notional idea of the 5th year of teaching. And for me, my reaction to that was, why? Why has it not been challenged? Why has it not been focused on? Why is it being allowed to happen? And that potentially research could unlock the door to this problem. And clearly it is a problem because it's been consistent, as it says there, for a number of years. And this is DFE data, so they do know about it. And I think that the early career framework is one way that they've tried to address it. But research is about trying to find out what is already out there, challenging that, and then potentially coming up with new or different ideas around what it could look like or what it should look like. So this was the stimulus, and you may already know this data, but I think it's important that I anchor myself into what provoked me into taking on my 2-year journey of my Masters. So what I wanted to do, I'm a positive guy. I like to look for the positives. I'm a solution finder. I was as a teacher, I was as a head teacher, I am as an ITT lecturer. And so I wanted to turn the question on its head. Rather than who leaves, I wanted to move it to how do we stay? What is it that certain people do that allow them to stay in teaching? Not potentially for as long as I have, but stayed in teaching. What have they done? Is there something that they're doing that we could identify or classify that others could then learn from us as IT providers to support the students that we teach? But then going beyond that into their early career framework. Is the early career framework doing what it needs to do? Or has it become a document that is done? And I think the distinction between those two positions is an important one for us to understand. So I actually worked out that there are 8,000 stories of people who have stayed in teaching. And I say the word stories, and I'm not going to tell you, well, I'm telling you a narrative of my journey into this research. But stories is because I did a narrative inquiry approach, and I'll articulate that in a moment for those of you who are less certain of what narrative inquiry might look like, because it's a lesser known research method for some, and I'll just give you my interpretation of what that is. But I wanted to find the 8,000 stories of those who stayed in teaching, got into their 6th year of teaching, and envisage a potential happy future in this profession that I love. So I turned it into a positive. I turned it on its head. Now, I found 3 researchers that really drove my understanding of narrative inquiry as an approach. And that in articulating our narrative, it can externalize a story. It can externalize a voice in our head that may not have been exposed before. And if we could identify the threshold experiences of those 5 years, self-identified by the participants that I've chosen, or had been selected by the process in which I went into, that their interpretation of that might give new insight into a solution to the problem that we find ourselves in. If they can identify their nuclear episodes, the significant things that have happened to them, the ones that have changed the direction, and it doesn't need to be all positive. I wasn't expecting this kind of happy-go-lucky story to come out, because I think we've got to move away from this notion that teaching is all wonderful and all perfect and all cotton wool, because as we well know, it isn't. So these narratives were going to be formed, and the questions that I was going to be asking were around these significant moments, these threshold experiences, nuclear episodes, or important epiphanies, as self-defined by them. Because what I've discovered was that they don't feel that they're the experts. And yet what I clearly identified was the people who have just gone through the first 5 years of teaching in this current context of teaching were the people that I was talking to. So I made them the experts. And I think that was a really important thing that I did in my journey. So initially, I thought that I could connect in with Bronfenbrenner's development of a child. And I saw a connection between the micro, macro, and meso systems of Bronfenbrenner. He was talking about a developing child, but I thought we were talking about a developing teacher. And therefore, there could be some synergy around that they were in the middle, there were people around them, and then there was a wider culture around that. And I didn't know until I did this research that there was a 4th dimension, the chronosystem, that these things change over time. So in Bronfenbrenner's model, these circles can expand and shrink depending on time. But for me, I looked at that and then I was trying to impose that upon teaching. And part of me wanted to go with it. And part of me was thinking, I think it might be different because it's not a child development, it's a teacher development, they're adults, there may be some differences. But again, I wanted to anchor it somewhere, and I felt this was a good place to start to anchor it, that there could be an individual in a school, in a government system of education in this country, and therefore this concentric model aspect might be useful to consider. So the narrative inquiry asks us, if we are going by Clandinin and Connolly, who are kind of pivotal seminal works in narrative inquiry world, that I need to go forwards and backwards, inwards and outwards. And that this time warp from the past to the present to the future was to become an important feature of my narrative inquiry. And that I discovered that we do a lot of looking backwards, but we don't do a lot of looking forwards. But actually the participants that I was speaking to were doing a lot of looking forwards. They could see a future, they were envisaging a future, they had a direction and a path to travel. And the inwards and outwards was that there was an internal and external influence on their experiences. We talk about a lot that's happening to them, but what about their articulation of what's happening within them, within themselves? And as I say, this internal narrative then becoming an externalized narrative, and me treating that as a precious thing to harness control, to amplify, and to show. So I had 4 participants in my study. So it was a very small study. It was very bespoke focus for narrative inquiry, when I went to multiple interviews with the same people to really dig down into their perception of their 5 years of experience. And what I found was that they were all able to consider a future, and that they were positioning their future against their past experiences, and that they felt in some ways an element of control over that. And that, to me, was something that I thought might be there, but I didn't know was going to be there. And only in asking them did I realize just how strong that situation was. And actually, it's become a massive part of future research as I take this further forwards, that we don't do enough of forecasting future. We do a lot of looking back, which is useful and has a role, but maybe that's part of the problem, part of the impacting, or things that are impacting on those student teachers that they're having to reconcile for themselves. And that potentially, as Lee said at the beginning, that we as ITTE providers can consider that, think about that, and in our own context, potentially offer them more opportunities to talk about a future and them having a control of that future. And as soon, you know what it's like, as soon as you identify something, you then can find it in other places, but you seek and you shall find. If you don't know what you're looking for, you won't find it. But I suddenly found more around this, and Conway was a really important person in terms of influencing my understanding of this. And he had talked, over 20 years ago around the importance of forecasting, and the power of doing that, or the potential implications of this forecasting, was that it helped them to modify both their expectations and their aspirations, as I put in the dissertation. That for some reason, it helped them to articulate a narrative for themselves, a story to live by, as in a story to live on with. And I think that was important. And talking to all 4 of the participants, it was absolutely clear that each of them had some control, or felt that they had some control, had a perception of control about their future. And that arguably then, those who don't, or those who leave, are the ones who don't have an opportunity to externalize their narrative, or don't have the opportunity to forecast a potential future, or that future looks so negative and so gloomy, they no longer want to be part of this profession. So one of the conclusions that I came to, colleagues, was that foresight may offer new narratives that ECTs could live by, and that this living by gave a direction, gave a purpose, gave a focus to the future, and that those who were able to do that were in a much stronger place. And I challenged the notion perpetuated by my ITTE provider currently, although we are starting to make some changes based on this research, that we spend too long dwelling in the present, and too much of the focus is on the past. And that could be potentially detrimental. So what we're doing at Kingston is we're starting to turn that round. We're starting to challenge that notion, and we're starting to get our student teachers to think in a different way, and to think more narratively. By that I mean past, present, and future. And that each of these has to be unpicked in order to create this story to live by. And I believe that I have a story to live by. And actually, I've learned a huge amount from the narrative inquiry approach in terms of me having a future, me having an articulated narrative, and me having a story to live by. And potentially that can be helpful for you as well. I hope it will be. That's the whole point. If I just took what was already there, if I just went with what was already being told of me, if I just went into the literature and had a look at what I was finding in the literature, I would have had a very different view of teacher retention. This is the teacher retention model that we get presented with if we look at much of the literature on this theme. We've started to dwell in the negative. But if we live with a negative narrative, we start to believe that negative narrative, which is why I try to turn it into a positive narrative. Many people talk of teacher attrition. Now that has a negative connotation in that wording, which is okay, it's fine to some degree. But if teachers come in believing that they're going into a profession with a huge amount of teacher attrition, that may be the problem, but that's not the solution. And in articulating that negative overall narrative, we're not in a good place, because we're going to have to fight against that with our own individual narrative. And that's very difficult when you don't have the experience that I'm guessing many of us have as ITE colleagues. Smithers and Robinson, which I believe is the Institute of Education up in London, did a huge study in 2003 identifying the characteristics of leavers. But that's like having an exit interview, isn't it? It's almost after the event, we want to find out what we could have done. Well, let's find out preemptively what those people who are doing good things, who are looking after themselves, who are creating a narrative for themselves, what are the characteristics of those? Because that could change the story, that could change the narrative. Morris et al., 2021, a very recent thing, teacher shortage, the same negative narrative. Perimenocalva, why teachers leave. It's the exit interview all over again. But I didn't want to talk to the leavers. They'd gone, they'd made the decision, they were past. What about the ones that have stayed? So I turned it round. I wanted to talk about teacher retention. How do we keep people in the system? How do we allow people to create their own narratives? How do we allow them to tell their own stories? And then we can change leavers into stayers. What are the characteristics of those who stay in the profession? And if we can identify that, if we can amplify that, then that would create a positive narrative for education, for student teachers, for early career teachers. And that would be a positive effect. And that we can start then not moving away from this self-fulfilling narrative of leaving and negativity. Let's turn it round to why teachers stay. What do they identify? What are the features of teaching that are important? What are the features of teaching that keep drawing us back day after day into the classroom? I'm sitting in a classroom right now. It's nearly 5 o'clock on a Monday afternoon. I'm still here. Why? And if we can identify these drivers, this ambition, this desire, this story to tell, then I think we'll be in a much stronger position. If you look at the narrative, folks, you hear this: too many government initiatives, high levels of workload, policy and inspection, inadequate pay. All of these things are in the literature if you look for them, and many of them are true. I feel as if I work hard. I feel that there are too many government initiatives. I don't feel as if I'm paid enough, but I'm still here. I'm still doing it. So there must be other reasons why. And actually, it wasn't that some of my participants didn't feel these effects, more that they were able to navigate around these effects. They were able to find a way of exploring other perceptions of these challenges, or to mitigate these challenges with other positive aspects of their job and identify that and put that into their story. Seek and ye shall find, folks. If you want to look for a lack of support from management, you can find it. There it is if you want to look for it. Feeling undervalued, absolutely. a target-driven culture. I think it's difficult to argue against that we're in a target-driven culture. But does that have to dominate our narrative? That was the question that I wanted to ask. So here were my research questions. What factors do 4 mainstream primary teachers identify as the most significant in their first 5 years of teaching? Nice and open, they can take it in whichever direction they want to take it. What are participants' experiences and what reasons do they attribute for these mentioned factors? And how do these recalled experiences, either positive or negative, so I wasn't looking for the cotton wool and candy floss, reaffirm their attention in the teaching profession? So I was looking for their articulation of their stories. And this is what I found, folks. I found a use for a Venn diagram, which was the first time I've used a Venn diagram since I was a GCSE student, and that was quite some time ago. What was clear was that there were 2 dimensions of teaching that weren't mentioned in the literature, weren't mentioned in the in how teaching is personified and written down in the teacher standards, in the early career framework. The emotional and relational dimensions of teaching are not prioritized. And yet, those of participants who wanted to stay in teaching managed their emotions, worked hard on mitigating that emotional dimension of teaching, and they spent a long and considerable amount of their time building relationships, sharing with others, having time with members of staff to support each other. And these 2 overlapping circles were essential for those who stayed. That when they got that overlap between those 2 dimensions, they were in a good place, we were okay. When there wasn't an overlap between those 2 circles, we were in danger of walking away because the person trying to be the teacher wasn't present. The person trying to be the teacher wasn't able to build relationships. And one of the main conclusions in my research for my master's was that it was implied in the definitions of teaching, teacher standards, early career framework, but that it needed to be spotlighted. It needed to recognize that these 2 dimensions of teaching are not superfluous, not extra, not down the bottom of the list of priorities. That if we can look after ourselves and if we can prioritize relationships, and surely teaching is relational, isn't it? I hope it is. Then we would be in a much stronger position. So the emotionality of teaching is important. That was one of the main conclusions that I came to. Participant 2 talked to me about relationships, and she was brilliant. She was fantastic. And one of the most pertinent things that she said to me was that teachers are taking on roles that would have traditionally been a parent's role. Therefore, we need to do more to help very young people going into a profession where they have to handle relationships with parents. And that's a significant part of our job. And it's a significant part of their job. And it's a significant factor on those who succeed and those who stay. And that we need to do more in our ITT programs, in early career framework, to manage that, to help and support that. I came to the conclusion that relationships can significantly impact, both positively and negatively, on an ECT's desire to remain in teaching. It was a significant factor. It was loud and across the board. And yet, if you look in the literature that was already there, it's not there. It's not loud, it's not amplified, and it's not as high profile as it needs to be from the experts that I spoke to. One thing that I really loved was the idea of this foresight, this future. And this person, P2, participant, was in a very challenging school, and she came to a school and she just saw her future personified in others and there were people who were in that school who she wanted to be in 10, 15 years' time. This idea of role models, I'm now taking it further forwards. We're now expanding that idea, and I'm taking that onto my doctorate to understand the importance of a personified future by people called role models in its old-fashioned term, although I don't think that phrase is a useful phrase to have at this point. And then I discovered that there was a third circle that I needed on my Venn diagram, colleagues, and that relational and emotional wasn't the whole story. And as I unpicked my data, as I went through the transcripts, I discovered the third dimension of teaching wasn't mentioned and wasn't as important as it needs to be. We're homogenizing teaching, that all schools are the same and all teachers need to be identical. But we all know that's not true, and that different schools are different places of education, and that we need to identify that, and we need to be sure that we're working in the right school. Lots of my participants, in fact, all of them had moved schools. And it was only in moving schools that had this comparative, a comparative between two contexts. And as a result of that comparative, they were able to see better things done well. They had all realized, or they had all felt that it was them, they were the problem. It was their fault. They weren't experienced enough. Why should they know any better? But actually, what they discovered was if they moved to a school that was going to look after them, did have a relational and emotional element to them, that they could be happy teachers. And it was somebody else. One beautiful quote from my fourth participant was this realization that only when she'd got out of a toxic school and moved into a lovely yet challenging cohort school, she just said, I didn't know it could be done this well till I came here. And I thought that was beautiful, but also worrying that so many of our teachers are leaving because they think it's them, but actually it may be the school doesn't fit their needs and they need to move schools. How many of our students leave for that reason? I think it could be quite high. So this was my conclusion, folks, as I'm coming to the end of my half an hour. This is my conclusion, that these three circles of my Venn diagram, the three dimensions of teaching that I think need to be prioritized and amplified, are emotional, relational, and contextual. And that these three circles overlap at all times for those students who stay. And that it changes over past, present, and future. And that the people that we need around us change, our emotions change, our context may change. But as long as we have an overlap, we're okay. That is the attribute of those who stay. And it wasn't Brofenbrenner, after all. It was close, but it wasn't concentric circles. It was overlapping Venn diagram circles. That was the conclusion that I came to. And the final point I'd like to make, folks, before we open it up into questions and a wider discussion with colleagues, is I just don't think that knowledge and skills is sufficient. That these two elements alone need to be supplemented by personal and intrapersonal experiences, because that's what teaching is. And I think what this research has taught me is the importance of those two dimensions of teaching. And hopefully that's provoked in you a consideration about how that affects you in your context. And I'd love to hear your responses to that very quick narrative around my narrative inquiry into early career teacher retention. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dave. Perfectly timed and really nice kind of overview of your research and some insights for us to think about. So I'm going to stop the recording there, and anyone who's watching this later on video will have to look you up on the Kingston website and pick up a correspondence with you.